Good evening, Lymm.
Good evening. Good evening.
Yes, this is Unidentified Flying Objects. As you can see from the little subtitle there, I'm asking the question, are there any images of UFOs that need an extraterrestrial explanation? And you can argue that statistics don't lie, and therefore, if you ask the question, I'm not actually asking you, but if you were to ask the question, have extraterrestrial aliens visited Earth? Well, it's perhaps surprising to realize that if you ask a whole load of Americans, anything up to 40% say yes or maybe. Admittedly, this is a fairly old survey. This is 2018, a survey carried out in America. I can't find anything specifically about the UK, nor anything more recent. So we'll just have to go with this somewhat old data. But if you ask a similar question, are terrestrial aliens visiting now rather than have they done in the past, you might think that would be a much lower number. Well, it's lower, but not by much. 35%. That is a very surprising figure, even to me. It's less than the number who believe in ghosts, apparently, but it's larger, the 35% that believe that extraterrestrials are amongst us today. That percentage is larger than the number that believe in telekinesis or the number that believe in Bigfoot. But the really worrying statistic is it's bigger than the number of Americans who apparently believe in evolution, at 31%. So take that as you will. Another way of looking at UFOs is think about the number of cameras that people carry with them. It used to be that if something odd appeared in the sky, nobody would have a camera on them to photograph it. But the number of people who have a camera on them everywhere they go, of course, has rocketed since the invention of the smartphone in the 2000s, and now it's approximately 100%. So you could argue, in the last few years, with very little fanfare, we've conclusively killed the idea of flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, Bigfoot, whatever. But despite the fact that everybody has a phone in their pocket, and therefore if these things really did exist, we would have some pretty good images of them by now, despite that, people will still argue about UFOs. No, it's not really settled whether UFOs are extraterrestrial or not. A little while ago, I tried Googling UFO just to see how many web pages were dedicated to the concept of UFOs. I got to around 250 million. So perhaps that's changed in the last few years, but it again shows a level of interest, if not a level of factual information. So despite the fact that we have so many cameras available to us now, this idea of what UFOs are is still not settled. I would argue that UFOs could be one of a number of things, and I've put them into different classifications. A UFO could actually be a man-made object, might be a man-made object. It might be a natural object. A UFO might be an artifact, in other words, something in the image you've taken with your camera, not actually something that's out there. And of course, some images will be deliberately faked. And we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room that there is one other possibility for a UFO, and that is it's extraterrestrial visitors in spacecraft. So there are 5 different categories, if you like. And I thought it was worth subdividing them into those 5 categories to make it easier to follow what I'm talking about. Before we start, let's just make sure we understand what definitions I'm using. I'm conforming to the usual convention that a UFO means something seen, usually in the sky, that cannot readily be identified. Regarding an extraterrestrial origin, I tend to side with Carl Sagan, who came up with the phrase, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So if you want to claim that this image is an image of an extraterrestrial spacecraft, that proof, that evidence has to be very strong before we will take such an extraordinary claim seriously. And very useful to the rational scientist is Occam's razor. For those who haven't heard of it, it basically says if there are 2 explanations for an observation or a whole set of evidence, if there are 2 explanations, then the one that requires the least speculation is more likely to be the correct one. And that's often paraphrased as basically simple solutions are more likely to be correct than complex ones. And I'll be using that once or twice to say, well, this could be an extraterrestrial visitor, but it's more likely to be something else. So where do we get reliable information about UFOs? Well, one place you can get reliable information about UFOs is you go to America and you have lots of these dotted around. You can tell this is reliable and serious because they've got a little green man sitting on the bench right at the front there. I wondered, what is the earliest evidence for UFOs? When did people first start recording them? And I saw this image and I thought, yeah, wouldn't it be wonderful if that's what UFOs actually looked like? If we had images like that, then there wouldn't be any debate. If you see something which is clearly not a man-made object, not something natural to the Earth, if it was clear, detailed, in focus, with no evidence of the camera being waggled around whilst the picture was being taken, correctly exposed, etc. If we had images like that, then that would settle the debate immediately. But unfortunately, 99% of the images of UFOs that are out there look more like that. They are just little blobs. They're usually blurred, they're usually out of focus, they're usually followed with camera movement, so we're not even sure if the object is moving or whether it's just the camera that's moving when the picture was taken. And they're often overexposed, especially the ones taken at night. The other problem is that a lot of UFO images were taken in the pre-digital age. Even though we've got thousands of images available now, a lot of UFO images were taken on film, and we've got no idea who took them, when they were taken, what time of year, what time of day, where were they pointing when the picture was taken, what was the exposure, how long was the exposure, what was the aperture, what was the focal length of the lens. None of this information is necessarily available. With modern digital cameras, when you take a picture with your phone, the phone records where it was you took the picture, what the focal length was, what the exposure was. All that so-called metadata, all of the context is available for digital images. But with analog images, effectively, all we know is that's what was photographed. And usually, it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, because these are old analog images. Making it bigger doesn't help. Instead of a small blob, you end up with a big blob. It doesn't help you understand. I've got no idea what that is, because I have no context as whether it was taken at night. Is it the planet Venus? Is it a bright street light? I've got no idea, because I've got no idea of the provenance, if you like, of the original image. When it came to the earliest one, I thought, well, that's interesting. I found this on the internet, and I thought, is this the earliest evidence of somebody getting an observation of a UFO? There's clearly an Apache helicopter in the top left, and it looks like Luke Skywalker's land speeder there, and possibly a Zeppelin below it. So you think, well, okay, obviously that's Photoshop. Obviously somebody has taken a picture of hieroglyphs and changed them to make them look like a helicopter, etc. No, that is a genuine picture of a wall somewhere in Egypt. I can't remember exactly where this is engraved. But once you realize what's actually going on, you can say, well, either this is clearly evidence that the Egyptians saw an Apache helicopter land at some point next to the pyramids, or you say, well, actually, no, the people who understand Egyptology and hieroglyphics know what's going on here. Basically, there are two pharaohs that made two sets of hieroglyphs. And just like if you reuse a piece of paper and don't fully erase the old bits before you start writing on the paper, well, one set of hieroglyphs was not completely erased before the other set of hieroglyphs were actually put onto this wall. If you superpose the two into different colors, you can see the blue and the green were from different pharaohs, and that gives the impression of an Apache helicopter, a land speeder, and a Zeppelin. But when you separate the two out, there's nothing interesting there at all. And sometimes that happens with images. You can be fooled at first sight to think you're looking at something, but actually you're not. So let's go through the first category of what UFOs might be. UFOs, quite a few UFOs, or things that are originally identified or labeled as UFOs, are actually man-made objects. The US Air Force have tried to make it easy for us. So for instance, if you think you see any of these objects flying by, especially next to a top secret US Air Force base, the US Air Force have made it easy by providing you with this chart so you know exactly what it is you're looking at. No, these are not top secret spy planes. The first one is a weather balloon. The second one is a weather balloon. The third one is a weather balloon. The fourth one is a weather balloon. The fifth one is a weather balloon. Any idea what that is? Swamp gas. The next one is a weather balloon, a weather balloon, a weather balloon. So in other words, no, none of these top secret objects are actually top secret objects. They just happen to be something that, yeah, it just happens to be flying next to a top secret US Air Force base. Okay, so maybe that's not to be taken too seriously. Here's an image, apparently taken at night. There's a little bit of a tree coming in on one side, and I think that's a leaf coming in at the top there. But we can ask ourselves, what is it that's been photographed here? Is it perhaps a long exposure photo of a fleet of UFOs flying into the distance? Well, if it's not UFOs, what do you think it is? Any guesses as to what it is that we've got here? Searchlights, okay. Shooting stars will never be in parallel, or shooting stars may indeed radiate from a point in space, but they'd never be that organized, as it were. And contrails, fair enough. Contrails of military aircraft or commercial aircraft? Well, commercial aircraft would never fly that close together or at different heights. They will tend to be at the same height. Remember, contrails only form, condensation trails only form at a particular altitude. So apparently, this is not contrails of aircraft. So what actually is it? Well, I have deliberately tried to throw you off the scent by saying, is this a long exposure of a lot of objects moving? Because nothing is actually moving in this particular image. I got this image from the well-known webpage, which I suggest you go and visit at some point, Pylon of the Month. So this is electricity. Yes, it is a real web page. It's Pylon of the Month, taken from December 2019. So this is an electricity pylon. You can't see it because it was misty that particular night. If I deliberately just show you what it would have looked like if you could see it, then you know what you're looking at. Yeah. So you can't see the pylon itself because it's misty. But in this particular case, water was on the cables, the water froze, you've got ice on the cables, and the ice is being illuminated by presumably a light that's just on the other side of that horizon. Once you realize it's a whole load of electricity cables, you see it immediately. But before that, you can easily be fooled. And yes, I suggest if anybody's interested, go visit pylonofthemonth.org. I kid you not, that's a real web page. I checked it earlier this morning, and it's still working. I don't know why people go around photographing pylons, but some people have got very odd hobbies. Of course, more recently, whenever people have seen rockets fired into the sky, especially in America, not so much in the UK, if a rocket goes up just before sunset, then the trail, the exhaust trail of the rocket effectively picks up the light from the setting sun, and you can get some really weird and wonderful exhaust trails. So you get, for instance, a Falcon rocket can leave very interesting tails, and in some cases the rocket goes up, there's no sign of the rocket anymore, but the exhaust trail it leaves behind, depending on what the air is doing, the air might have lots of winds at different altitudes that produce originally a nice vertical trail, gets distorted into something that looks like that. And the iridescence in the colors there is just a function of the fact that there's a little bit of rocket fuel mixed in with the actual contrail or the exhaust trail itself. So you can get a lot of really weird effects when you are looking at rockets launching. And again, if you ever saw this in the sky, you would perhaps be forgiven to think, is this a sign of alien invasion? I'll occasionally have this reference at the bottom, APOD. APOD is short for Astronomy Picture of the Day. NASA have a web page in which every day they show a new picture of something interesting. And this happened to be the Astronomy Picture of the Day back in April 2019. It's actually a whole load of sounding rockets that have been launched to let gas out at a very high altitude, which then fluoresces different colors depending on the radiation from the sun. So this is a way of finding out what is going on in the upper atmosphere. You send up a sounding rocket, you release a whole load of gas, and then you watch it over the next minutes or hours, and clearly some parts are moving, some parts seem to disperse without much motion. You get an idea of what's going on up there. It helps people understand the aurora borealis, which again is an interaction between particles coming from the sun and the molecules within our own atmosphere. So this is basically a scientific experiment. But if you didn't know that experiment was happening and you just looked out and saw these things in the sky, you could be forgiven to think something very odd is happening and something very alien is happening. A couple of decades ago, the sight of lots of dots flying around in the sky could have been misinterpreted as something alien. We're now much more used to the idea, especially in the last 5 years or so. The idea of a few dots flying around in the sky doesn't scare us anymore because we are all aware of the concept of drones, and if you fly them at night with lights, we're much more used to the idea of drones in very high precision formation. That's relatively recent. 10 years ago, it was difficult to fly them in high precision. A long time ago, they were just almost like random clouds. So we're not going to be fooled by drones anymore because we're much these days used to the idea. Some people claim, yeah, as well as UFOs, we can see where the UFOs land. So here are 3 landing pads for UFOs in the desert. And again, this is fairly easy to deal with because whoever took this picture must have known when they took the picture. And if you know when you left your destination and when you're going to arrive, when you left your departure point, when you arrive at your destination, if you know the time, you can work out roughly which part of America you were flying over when you saw these objects. And then all you need to go is, Google Earth and say what is actually located at that point. And you find there's a solar plant there. A solar plant with a whole load of mirrors that are reflecting sunlight to a furnace there to get hot. At a distance, especially at altitude, the reflection from all of these mirrors can look rather odd. But that's basically all that was being picked up in that earlier picture. Yes, it looks unusual. Yes, it is unusual. But that doesn't mean alien. When I was looking at images, because it's really images that I'm interested in on the whole, but whilst I started looking for UFO images, not surprisingly, I kept getting diverted onto UFO videos. And this one was very popular a few years ago. I've taken the audio off because the people doing the photography were American and there was a very annoying soundtrack, but they were videoing this hovering UFO hovering over the lake. And this went viral in the sense of they posted it on YouTube and it got millions of hits of people saying, wow, that's clearly a cigar-shaped UFO floating over the lake here. Even though this was refuted within hours of it being posted, it still got millions of hits of people saying, look, it's a UFO. Within hours, the explanation was there. The Goodyear blimp. They said, don't want to get in the way of a good story, but that is definitely us. There's a football stadium on the other side of the lake. Of course, there's a Goodyear blimp hovering over the top to get nice photos. So the point here is, even when the explanation is there, even when basically the idea of an extraterrestrial spacecraft has been put to bed, that doesn't stop people sharing this information on social media saying, look, here's a fantastic video of a UFO. Whilst getting diverted to that UFO video, I saw a reference that said, hey, this guy has got super clear footage of a UFO. I thought, fantastic. It's about time somebody got a really good, clear view of a UFO. So here it is. Are you ready for it? So I think it's all fairly obvious what that is, yes? After a little while, this is a video camera, probably on full zoom, looking at an object some distance away, and the person behind the camera is finding it very difficult to hold the camera still. After a minute or so, perhaps they either sobered up or they started to lean against a wall and steadied the camera, at which point it was then a little bit clearer what it was they were actually photographing. There we go, just zoom in a little bit and I'll take a still. Is it now obvious what it is? Some child called Jennifer or Johnny or Jeremy, whatever, Julie, yeah. Somebody had a birthday party and their balloon escaped. Mylar balloons are very reflective, and so when the sun catches them, they can be seen from enormous distances. So this was quite a way away with this very long zoom lens. But again, whilst getting torn down this avenue of what happens when people claim to have got a clear view of a UFO, I saw this claim, and this one piqued my interest. I did not want to spend the rest of my life on YouTube watching UFO videos, but I thought maybe this one is worth looking at. Puerto Rico, proximity to the Bermuda Triangle may explain why it's a hotbed of UFOs. There have been countless sightings, but many experts, I don't know who these experts are, but many experts consider this next piece of footage the gold standard. I did not want to go and look at thousands of videos, but if this one is considered to be the definitive proof that the UFO is an extraterrestrial spacecraft, I figured, well, it's probably worth looking at that one. And if we can figure out what that is, then we don't need to watch the other 999 videos because we know that they are less convincing than this. So the video in question was taken by the US Customs and Border Patrol. As far as I know, they have good quality gear. This is in an aircraft, a camera is looking down, and given that they are interested in immigration and contraband coming over the US border, they have some good quality camera. So this is an infrared camera, so let's run the video so we can see. There's an object. The object is dark. This is infrared. Dark means warm. Lighter colors mean cooler. Dark means warmer. So they appear to be in this aircraft looking down at the ground, and they have found this object which they are trying to track, and it seems to be going hell for leather across the ground there. We're not too sure how high off the ground it is, but we'll come to that shortly. It's going over trees in this case, and it goes over fields. There's some cows in the background there, I think. It goes over, I think, an industrial estate. Eventually, it comes over the airport, a few more industrial places in the background. There's a taxiway on the airport, and eventually it flies over the runway of the airport and then continues a little bit further north. I thought this was interesting for a number of different reasons. A, it's a quality camera, and hence the UFO can be seen from quite some distance away. It's also a long video in the sense it's not just 5 seconds and you can't get the context. This is a sort of 2 or 3 or 4 minute video in which you can get a pretty good idea of what's going on. But the reason I jumped on this as this is worth looking at in detail is because of all this useful information around the outside. In particular, if we have a look at that in the bottom left-hand corner, ACFT, aircraft. This is the latitude and longitude of the aircraft. Every frame of the video records exactly where the aircraft was when it took that image. It also, because it's a computer-controlled camera looking down at the ground, the aircraft knows where it is. It knows its height, and it knows its GPS location, and it knows which direction the camera is pointing, which means it knows exactly what the GPS coordinates of the ground is inside that white cross. And that's recorded there, the target. So we know the GPS location of the aircraft and its height, and we know the GPS location of the point the camera is looking at. Admittedly, the object itself isn't necessarily dead in the middle, and we don't know exactly how high the object is, but we do know where the camera is pointing, and we know that for every video frame. So I thought this is worth looking at. Let's take all of the information. Some of the stills, the object flew over a field, and there's lots of these dark objects in the background. I think those dark objects are probably cows. And so this object is probably smaller than a cow. So I'm not sure exactly what size, but the object might be a fraction of a meter in size. And we see the object flying over a road. There's a whole load of cars, relatively light, except for the engine, which is very warm, and the dark blob there. And again, the tarmac of the road is a little bit darker than the surrounding land. So it all seems to make sense. If we take the GPS coordinates, I found that all of this was Puerto Rico, as indeed the label, the caption of the YouTube video said it was in Puerto Rico. It's all around about the Rafael Hernandez Airport. Remember, we saw it over the runway of the airport. Just for scale, that's 1 kilometer. And because the colors are rather garish, let's just take that down a little bit. And let's plot out the target, the bottom right coordinates, to see where this UFO appeared to be. Remember, this is the ground track. In other words, it's not necessarily the UFO, it's the ground immediately behind the UFO. And the caption of the YouTube video says, look, the UFO is traveling towards the northeast. And yet the wind was blowing from the northeast. So this UFO was actually traveling into a headwind. Therefore, it must have been propelled by something. Even though we can't see the engine, it must have been something very alien to make this object move into a headwind. That's the claim. So that's the ground track of the UFO. I also plotted out what the aircraft was doing and found these. This is sort of every 20 seconds, I think. Every 20 seconds, I made a note of where the aircraft was. So what we can do is to say, at any given point, we know where the aircraft is and we know which direction the camera was pointing. So for instance, we can say, if we take the third point, that's where the aircraft was, and the camera was pointing in that direction, and so the UFO appeared to be somewhere in front of that blue point. Remember, we can't be exact, but we know it's in that direction. What we can do is to say, well, where was it 20 seconds later or 40 seconds later? So let's do that. Let's go forward and say, well, later it appeared to be somewhere along that line. And then later it appeared to be somewhere along that line. And then later along that line, then later along that line. What do we notice about all of those straight lines? Either the object is at ground level and moving into a headwind, or possibly, maybe the object is there and not moving at all. The only reason it seems to be moving that way is because the aircraft is going hell for leather in the opposite direction. You know, when you go down a motorway in your car, static streetlights seem to be moving backwards against the backdrop of more distant objects. It's obvious when you think about it that the only reason that this thing appears to be moving is because the aircraft is running at, I don't know, 200 miles an hour, 200 knots, something like that, in the opposite direction. If we take the video, I haven't shown you the full video, but if we run the video a little bit further, the aircraft actually goes a long way to the south. Remember the scale? It's actually many kilometers away from the UFO, but wonderful infrared camera can still see it. And there is the smallest bit of evidence that the object actually moves a little bit during the few minutes of that video. The object actually moves a little bit in the southwest. Exactly what you would expect if the wind is blowing from the northeast. So you can take the description in the YouTube caption. Remember, this is the gold standard that definitively proves that UFOs exist as extraterrestrial spacecraft. The description says what we are clearly seeing is a metallic orb moving at incredible speed with no obvious propulsion into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. Clearly, nothing can do that. And the infrared camera sees an object that does not match anything we know of. Say these experts, these many experts say, I can't fathom what on earth this object is. Bear in mind that there is absolutely no evidence that it's a metallic orb. All it is a splodge, probably a warm splodge, but you can't really tell accurately its size, you certainly can't tell its shape, and there's no way that you can say it's necessarily metallic. Moving at incredible speed, you can't judge the speed of an object when you're in an aircraft that is itself moving at 200 miles an hour. No obvious propulsion. Well, I agree, there's no engines on this thing. This little splodge doesn't appear to have wings, doesn't appear to have an engine, so I'd agree with that one. Into an 18-mile-an-hour headwind. No, there's no evidence that it's actually moving into a headwind. And this idea that it doesn't match anything we know of, who are these experts that can't figure out what it is they're actually looking at? So we employ Occam's razor. That's one explanation for what we're looking at, but there are alternative explanations. An alternative is the object is essentially static. It's drifting perhaps slowly downwind. After 5 minutes, it's moved just a little bit. I think it's a balloon. And if it is a balloon, well, we can revisit that tick. If it is a balloon with no obvious propulsion, well, obviously it's got propulsion. It's going downwind. So the wind is propelling it. So we could take that tick out and replace it with a cross. So there's Occam's razor. We have a very complex explanation based on extraterrestrial spacecraft, or we have it's a balloon. And there is no evidence that gives you any indication that the left-hand explanation is any better than the right-hand one. If they both explain the facts, Occam's razor says, take the simple one. There you go. Okay, we've had man-made objects. UFOs might be natural objects. So instead of pylon of the month, now we've got the Cloud Appreciation Society. And the cloud of the month, in January of which year I can't remember, we can get these lenticular clouds, which are sometimes mistaken for UFOs. We have this rather odd situation of why on earth is there a big circle in this particular cloud? Perhaps this ought to be in the man-made section because that's a natural cloud, but it's probably been perturbed by an aircraft flying above it, producing this particular odd effect. Again, we get lenticular clouds that look a little bit like UFOs. That is just a cloud that I love because it looks like the opening scene of Independence Day or something. And again, some people say clearly a large flying saucer has punched its way through the cloud here or maybe further back there. No, this is a known phenomena. It's called full streak and it's a meteorological phenomena. I'm not going to describe how they come to be, but basically we understand how those form naturally. You sometimes get these rather odd lenticular clouds on the top of mountains. Even though that's a rather beautiful image all of its own right, that doesn't stop people on social media saying, look at this cloud and look at how I can enhance it if I use Photoshop. So yeah, people will always go overboard on these sorts of things. Again, we don't tend to see these in the UK, but in northern latitudes where it's often much colder, you can sometimes see these light pillars. It looks like searchlights shining up into the night sky. It's a lot more simple than that. This is an image from Finland. Whenever you get icy conditions, whenever you're below zero, you can get ice, platelets of ice, small hexagonal platelets of ice hanging in the atmosphere, and they tend to sit horizontally. And if you have a small platelet of ice horizontal, it's effectively a mirror, which means you're actually seeing lights over the back of the houses here. They're just street lights, and you just happen to be seeing them because you're looking at light reflected from small particles of ice hanging in the atmosphere. But it can still be quite spectacular if you've never seen it before. Sometimes here the colors are simply because the street lights were different colors. I'm not sure if they were actually orange and blue, but you can get a wonderful effect. And if the ice happens to be very high in the atmosphere, you can actually get a reflection, not just above the horizon. You can actually get a reflection of lights way up into the sky. And that must be fantastic to actually see. It's like looking at a city in the sky. And again, if you didn't know these things existed, you could perhaps be forgiven for thinking, wow, there's something really weird happening up there in the upper atmosphere. There are lots of atmospheric phenomena which are perfectly natural, but not necessarily particularly well understood. For instance, red sprites, we didn't actually know these existed until relatively recently because it's easier to capture them on cameras than it is to actually see them with your naked eye. They're not as bright as this would indicate. A sprite is effectively, in a sense, lightning that occurs above a storm cloud. We're used to the idea of a storm cloud having either lightning within the cloud or lightning to the ground. We didn't realize it's actually possible for lightning to go upwards from a storm cloud, and those tend to produce these effects. And for quite a while, people said they've seen these red sprites and they were told, you're crazy, there's no such thing. Now we know that they are real, but still don't fully understand. And the best images of red sprites so far are absolutely amazing. You think, wow, how can you look at that and not think we're being invaded by aliens? So we really don't understand what's going on here. It's a bit like forked lightning at the bottom, but what's going on and why do they have this structure and why is it a sort of diffuse glow at the top and forked at the bottom? So a beautiful image, but still people are doing research, meteorological research, to try and understand why these things happen above storm clouds. But we know that they are natural, despite the fact that they look incredible. Another astronomy picture of the day from a few years back. This was observed and published in an Ontario newspaper, where I'll show you the image in just a second, but let me deal with the text first. The text said, "Near the end of the day, I sat down on my deck facing west, and something caught my eye, a very bright, brilliant white light in the sky. I cannot be sure what it is, but my conclusion is a UFO. A reminder that whenever somebody sees something that they can't immediately explain, sometimes a knee-jerk reaction is, it must be a UFO. And I don't know what it is, so it's probably an alien spacecraft. My friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners." Interesting. I thought 1 airliner, but maybe he's right, okay. It's a reminder that if you're looking at a bright splodge in the sky, if you don't know the distance to that splodge, you have no idea of its actual size. How do you know if it's a really big object a long way away or a really small object relatively close to you? If you can't judge the distance, then you have no idea of the size. So stating that it's as big as 2 airliners means absolutely nothing. In this case, this object is distinctly different from an object the size of 2 airliners, because if you think about it, what are you likely to see if you are looking west just after sunset when you see a very bright light in the sky? Venus, the evening star, is very bright and is often seen in the west after sunset. It is exceptionally bright and arguably is the one object that is most confused with UFOs. Of all the UFO reports there have ever been, Venus is responsible for the majority of them, probably more than 50% of them. Certainly it is the largest contribution to UFOs. What was actually seen when you zoom in with this telephoto lens that this person had is a crescent. Yes, Venus shows crescent phases, just like the moon does, depending on where the sun is illuminating the moon. The moon can be a crescent phase or a half phase or a full moon. Venus is the same. It's an object, it's a very bright object, and at this particular point, it was lit by the sun and showed a crescent phase. Hence, when he zoomed in with his camera, he saw this, quote, arc-shaped UFO. Any astronomer knows that when you see something in the west after sunset and it looks really bright, then 99% of the time it's Venus, and then you go to other possibilities. So we've had man-made objects. We've had natural objects. Third category is a lot of UFOs are image artifacts, especially when you get the situation of, I take a picture, doesn't matter whether it's with a modern phone or an old camera, I take a picture, and when I look at the picture, I see things that I don't remember seeing when I took the picture. If you see things on the image you've just taken that you don't remember seeing at the time, 99% of the time, you're looking at an artifact of taking the picture. It's nothing to do with what was in front of the camera, it's what's going on inside the camera. For instance, and it's not a new phenomena, here we have Washington, DC in 1952. We seem to have a whole set of, what are they, butterflies, bumblebees, UFOs, extraterrestrial spacecraft, TIE fighters from Star Wars. It's difficult to see what they actually are, but there's a whole fleet of them buzzing the Capitol building in Washington, DC. Well, that might be the explanation for what they are, but any rational scientist will say, okay, you've taken a picture and you've got these dots. What's going on down here? You've got a whole load of lights that are shining into the camera. Let's take those lights. Let's imagine that they were reflected. And let's see how they match up with these dots at the top there. Match, double match, 2 together. Can't really see these 2 because they're in front of the dome, and this one. In other words, all we're looking at is reflections of whatever those floodlights or street lights are at the front there. Lenses produce reflections. Ideally, the lens on the camera, regardless of whether it's a phone or a good high-quality camera, Light will go through the lens and produce the image, and some of the light, hopefully not too much, but some of the light will get reflected off the lens surfaces. And if you're dealing with a very bright source of light, it's not surprising that some of that gets reflected and sometimes appears in the image. This is another example because it first appeared as an image in which they said, the person who took the photo says, the large craft came so close to the photographer that windows can even be seen in the image. I assume they mean this window here. And you can see the pilot waving as the extraterrestrial spacecraft goes by. UFO sighting is 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth. You can tell they're serious because aliens is in capital letters. See, that tells you how serious they are about this statement. But again, this is a blow-up, and when you look at the original image, you say, oh, right, the original image has got a really bright moon shining into the camera. I don't know what the phase of the moon is. It might be a full moon. It's difficult to tell, but clearly you've got a horizon down here. If you point a camera at a really bright object and overexpose it, which is what you've done here, then the chances are you might get a reflection. I think this is a relatively old camera because I think, with all due respect to the person who took it, it's a relatively poor quality lens and it's produced a horrible reflection that looks distorted. But I can pretty much guarantee that that is just a reflection of the very bright moon reflected off some of the internal glass elements of the lens that was used. More recently, somebody has done effectively the same thing. They've taken a rather nice shot, and when they got home, they said, I don't remember that in the sky, in the background. What was that doing hovering there? What is this? It seems to have a sort of glow around it. It seems to have an aura around it. Is it a UFO? This was posted on Twitter. So, of course, it gets a hashtag UFO. And just to show that they were serious, it also got a hashtag serious question. What actually is this? And again, if you look at it and blow it up, what are we actually looking at? Well, it appears to be a sort of semicircle with some really weird structure in there. But ask yourself, what's the brightest thing in the image? The sun is coming directly into the camera. The sun looks like it's right on the edge of the wall. It's not surprising to realize that the sun, which is a disk, is peeking out from behind the wall. So the sun is a semicircle. And what's this? Well, it's just the filigree work of the stand that's holding the lamp in place. That is exactly what you would expect to get if you take the sun, chop half of it away, shine it through the filigree of this lamp, and let it bounce around inside the camera lens such that a rather weak reflection, remember, that is much, much less intense than that by a factor of many thousands. So it's only a weak reflection, but with a strong enough source of light, you will see that reflection. When it comes to looking at objects like this, excuse me while I just grab another prop, we can look at something like that and say, okay, what is this huge slab in the sky? This was the text that came with this particular image says, I went out one evening and what appears to be a large, flat, rectangular aircraft appears to be hovering in the air. It seems to have light around its edges, slightly rounded edges, but it appears to be hovering in the sky. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed it's an advanced type of spy craft known as a TR-3B. Notice how you get an extra level of credibility by giving it a load of letters and numbers. Rather than just saying this is a UFO, if you say, no, it's not just a UFO, this is a TR-3B, so this must be important. So you look at that and you think, what could it be? Well, there's headlights, so it's taken at night. There's specks there, so I suspect this is looking through the windscreen of a car or a van at night when it's raining. Does that help us understand? Well, it's not so much the rain and the at night as much as this is taken through the windscreen of a car. So is this a large rectangular slab of aircraft in the sky, or is it somebody's iPhone sitting on the dashboard? And we're just looking at the old iPhones had a little bit of metal around the outside, so they would have appeared to be lit on the outside and black on the inside. Is it more likely that we're looking at the reflection of an iPhone or a large rectangular aircraft slab in the sky? Occam's razor again. Fourth category, we've had man-made, we've had natural, we've had image artifacts. Unfortunately, some images are faked and have been not just a recent phenomena. People have been faking UFO images for an awful long time. If you need somebody's finger pointing at it, you know it's a fake. And if ever something like that happened, if ever a spacecraft that size came and hovered over a US city such that millions of people could see it, I think we would have heard about that by now. So that, again, is fairly obviously a fake. But when you look at older images, you might have to stop and say, well, is that fake or is that not? Here's one from 1966, clearly taken on photographic film, not with a digital camera back in those days. One of my research interests is image processing and image analysis. And this is what got me started in the first place, thinking, is it possible to tell whether an image has been faked or not? I then got diverted into videos and other things. But looking at this wasn't too difficult to figure out, because we can look at the UFO and we can look at some other detail in the image. In this case, I'm reliably informed that these are probably tram power lines here. Or we could look at the houses themselves. And we notice that the UFO is rather fuzzy and the tram lines are very sharp. That's not because you focused on the tram lines. With the camera in use here, if you focused on the houses, the UFOs would be in focus as well. It's not a question that the UFO is moving. If it was moving, it would be blurred in one direction, but not in the other. Nope, these are definitely cut and paste onto the images, and they've been blurred a bit too much because they wouldn't be that blurred if they were taken at the time with whatever exposure was used to get the houses and the tram lines in. So this has been faked by somebody who over-blurred the UFOs that have been put into the image. This is exactly the opposite. This is part of a video. Shocking new footage of alien ship over Chicago. Best UFO sighting. Okay, it's a bit dark, so what I did was take this image and brightened it so I can see this so-called triangular UFO in the sky. That's what you get if you brighten the image. In this case, the mottling in the background is perfectly normal noise because you're exaggerating a dark sky in order to make it a little bit brighter. So this is normal noise that you would expect in the background. But look at the triangular UFO, absolutely razor sharp. Whereas what you would expect is if you've got this much noise in the image, then these edges should be equally blurred and mottled. But that's not what we see. In this case, the person who's taken this triangular UFO and placed it in the image has made it too sharp, not too blurred. But you can see that these things are not correct. This is two UFOs buzzing Air Force One. Again, I don't think so. When objects are at a distance, the light from the distant objects gets scattered by the atmosphere, which is why everything looks just a little bit blue and certainly looks relatively low contrast. Even the black of the engines looks dark grey, not black, etc. So these two drones are too contrasty. They're either drones that are much closer to us, or if they are supposed to be in the distance, they've simply been cut and paste, and whoever put them in there hasn't made the contrast low enough to make it look like they're actually at the same distance as Air Force One. I wondered how quantitative you could be on these things. This is the deck of an aircraft carrier. There's a F-18 jet fighter, for those who know their USAF military, a helicopter, and obviously a big triangular UFO sitting there. To my eyes, everything else looks genuine, and I wondered, is it possible to prove that this triangular object was not actually sitting on the deck? So I had a look at the actual pixel values. Again, this is what I used to do for my research, is actually image processing and image analysis. I took a whole load of pixels right next door to the F-18 jet, and I recorded and plotted out what is the intensity of those pixels. And you find that when all of the pixels are roughly the same intensity, you get numbers like 70, 71, 72, 69, 68. They vary as you go from pixel to pixel to pixel. The intensity on this scale, doesn't really matter what the units are, you would expect a little bit of variation because it was taken with a camera. There's always a little bit of noise. Everything is imperfect. So to see this sort of variation as you go along this particular track of the deck of the aircraft carrier, that is exactly what you would expect. That looks perfectly natural to me. I did the same thing by looking at pixels across a particular part of the deck right next door to the UFO. What do we see? Perfectly normal, whoa, 71, 71, 71, 71, 71, 71, and then it varies again. That has quite definitely been doctored. You will never find a natural variation of pixel values that simply give you a plateau like that. That is an artificial part of the image which has been either cut and paste from something else or artificially smoothed after the triangular UFO has been placed there. The shadow doesn't look right either. The shadow looks far too sharp for a sun illuminating a triangular UFO that looks like that. So just with a little bit of demonstration, you can show conclusively that that is not a natural picture of an object sitting on the deck of the aircraft carrier. And finally, this is one still out of a video in which somebody is on their way to the Canary Islands or something, and their EasyJet aircraft, they were photographing the wing and they saw this particular object fly by, which they said, "Isn't this amazing? I've seen this UFO fly past the aircraft." Well, maybe they did, but looking at this and talking to a colleague of mine, they said that bears a striking resemblance to a video game I've just been playing. I can't name it for legal reasons, but basically that is a particular aircraft from a particular video game, and it bears a striking resemblance to this little object that again has been cut and pasted into the video to make it look like this object was flying past the EasyJet wing. Of course, these days with AI, you can fake anything you like. It will get more and more difficult to actually tell whether an image has been faked, because the fakery is getting more and more good at giving you convincing looking images. We're not there yet, but in another 5 or 10 years, it will probably be impossible to tell whether it's a genuine image or an AI-generated image. So we've been through the 4 categories of it could be man-made, it could be natural, it could be an image artifact, and it could be faked. And we have to admit that there is one other possibility that hasn't been discussed, and that is, well, maybe UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. To make it easier for us to catalogue them, somebody has done that for us. So here, UFO sightings, 80, I'm sure you can't read this, 80 UFO models based on actual sightings. So here somebody has taken sightings of UFOs and catalogued them into A1, A2, A3. Some of them look very similar to each other. Some of them are obviously different, like triangular ones, etc. But there you go. I find it interesting because A, it's based on actual sightings, and B, I noticed this is set number 1. So this is only 80 of them. Maybe there's set number 2 somewhere I haven't found with another 80. Okay. But NASA had a report a few years back. NASA decided to have an investigation into this. They didn't call them UFOs. The new name is UAPs, either unidentified aerial phenomena or unidentified anomalous phenomena. The report that came back from NASA after a committee sat and went through all the evidence, and they spent a few £1 million on this report, they came back with the statement that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Remember that from slide number 2 a little while ago? They also said that it's very difficult to figure out what these images are because the metadata, the who took it, where, when, which camera, what focal length, what exposure, what aperture, etc. All of that is missing from 99% of images that they were looking at, and hence a thorough understanding of context is difficult. This, again, I said quite a few slides ago. They conclude there's no real evidence for extraterrestrial origin for UAPs. Instead of spending millions of pounds, if they had come to me in the first place, I could have told them all of this and saved taxpayers an awful lot of money. But the bottom line is, when you think about it, okay, extraterrestrials, yeah, okay. Why shouldn't there be any extraterrestrials? There's a lack of evidence that any of these UFOs are actually extraterrestrial spacecraft. But why don't we have any evidence? Why isn't it obvious? Why haven't they visited? Why haven't we found evidence by looking out into the universe and seeing evidence that clearly a civilization must have produced that, or that does not look like a natural phenomena? It must be some other civilization we don't know about. If we simply do the sums and say, how many stars are there in the Milky Way galaxy? This is not the universe, this is just our home galaxy. There are something like 300 billion stars in the Milky Way. When I was a lad, we didn't know how many of them had planets. We really didn't know whether a solar system like ours was normal or completely weird. In the last few years, we now know that there are thousands upon thousands of exoplanets, planets around other stars, that we've been looking at, and we can work out, roughly speaking, statistically, how many stars in the Milky Way are likely to have planetary systems around them. The answer is a huge number, like half of them. Planets are not rare things. Solar systems are not rare. If we take 300 billion stars, we think probably there are 150 billion solar systems out there. Some stars seem to be still making their solar systems. Many of them have already finished and have got a family of planets. Of those planets around these stars, how many of them look like Earth? We didn't know 20 years ago, we didn't know when I was a kid, how many of them could conceivably be like the Earth as opposed to be like Jupiter or Saturn or some other planet. It turns out quite a few of them are Earth-like, perhaps as many as 1 in 3 are Earth-like. That doesn't mean a duplicate of Earth, it means something of a similar size and a similar mass. It doesn't mean they necessarily have water, but something in the same ballpark. So there might be 50 billion planets that look a little bit like Earth out there. But the real problem is, how do we work out whether or not they have life? We have no idea how to calculate the probability that life arises. We can say that these Earth-like planets are suitable for life. We know it happened here. If these Earth-like planets have oceans, isn't it likely that life would start in these Earth-like environments? We have no idea. So the likelihood of that happening, you can put a really big number on it or a really small number. Let's assume that 99% of these Earth-like planets do not have life, that we're only getting 1% of them where life originated. So we divide by 100 and then we get a number 500 million. What's the likelihood that if life does find a way, as they say in Jurassic Park, what's the likelihood that that life will become complex multicell rather than just amoebas? We have no idea. Let's assume that if life does find a way, 99% of the time it doesn't evolve into anything interesting. So in other words, we divide by 100 again. Complex life, 5 million different sites in the Milky Way. If complex life does evolve, what's the probability that that complex life ever results in something like us? We have no idea. Let's assume that when complex life does evolve, 99% of the time, nothing interesting happens. You don't get any intelligent beings on those planets. Divide by 100 another time. We're now down to 50,000. Still a big number. If there are 50,000 civilizations in our Milky Way, where are they? This is the so-called Fermi paradox. Why have we not heard from them? Some people say, okay, civilizations may have evolved 50,000 times, but they all blow themselves up in a few years, and therefore they don't last. That's a rather depressing thought. Might be true, of course, might be true. And some people say, well, yes, but they might have evolved millions of years ago and they're not around anymore. Again, that's a possibility. But if lots of civilizations have existed in the Milky Way, what happens with intelligent beings on the Earth, regardless of where we evolved, when we started in Olduvai Gorge in Africa, but it's only thousands of years later, or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years later, we've colonized effectively the whole of the surface of the Earth. And it's been calculated that if you wanted to, you could colonize the entire Milky Way galaxy in only 2 or 3 million years. So if any of these civilizations did crop up 10 million years ago, 20 million years ago, 30 million years ago, they would have had plenty of time to colonize the galaxy, and yet we see no sign of them out there. There's no big sign on the moon saying we were here. So we still don't understand whether the numbers are wrong, which they could be, or there is intelligent life out there. The bottom line is we have no evidence that they have ever visited. It might be that they're out there and they're ignoring us. It might be that they're out there and they're so spread out they have never encountered us, and when they look at Earth they think that looks like a fairly boring planet, there's not much point going there. So the bottom line is we don't know. The only thing we know is that life has evolved here. That pixel is the pale blue dot. That is Earth as viewed from the Voyager spacecraft, which is leaving the solar system. On its way out of the solar system, it looked back to take a picture of us. As Carl Sagan said, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. This is Pale Blue Dot, Carl Sagan, 1994. It's a reminder that when we talk about extraterrestrials or extraterrestrial life, the only life we actually know about is here on Earth. There might be life in the oceans of the icy moons of Jupiter or the icy moons of Saturn, which is why we're exploring, to see if there's life out there. But the bottom line is we don't know. But what I find more unsettling than the idea that we might have been visited by extraterrestrials is the fact that we actually might be alone. Thank you all very much.